The drawing is ready and the paper lays secured on the painting board with the tape. Now we have to mask the fine flowers on the foreground. I use a masking marker. It has a sharp point and it's perfect to make very fine lines. You can also use a masking fluid to mask the bigger areas with a brush. In the description you will find all the supplies I've used. A flat brush for wetting the paper, a couple of round brushes and fine brushes. They can be synthetic or natural. Let's look at different brushes and what strokes you can create with them. When you paint, it's nice to know what brush to use here and there. A broad flat brush is nice for wetting the paper. You can use it for making broad strokes or to draw lines if you turn the brush. A round brush is nice for painting the background. It doesn't have a sharp point, so it's not interesting for precise, detailed work. Here I use a red sable brush, which is the best natural brush. Or you can use a synthetic one. It is best not to use a squirrel brush. It absorbs much water and it's not as resilient as red sable or a synthetic brush. I will show the difference later in the tutorial. A round synthetic brush with a finer point. You can create broad strokes and a finer one with just a point. Another example of a flat brush. You can make broad strokes, and if you turn the brush, you can draw very fine long lines. To make such lines, it's much easier with this brush than with a fine round brush. The broad strokes can be very artistic. A flat rounded brush creates rounded flat strokes. But if you turn the brush, you can't create a thin fine lines as with a flat brush. This brush is nice to diffuse the colors on a wet background. Fine round pointed brush is great for fine lines and painting details. A very fine brush is nice for small details. You can't draw the long lines with it as it holds not very much water and paint. This brush is great to make long fine lines. Red sable round brush with a long thin point. It holds enough paint and water. The red sable is resilient and you can create beautiful long lines. This brush is also shaped to make your grip far from the point easy. The strokes you can vary between broad and very fine. The last brush I want to show is synthetic all-around brush. It is thick but with a very fine point. I love this brush. You can paint almost the whole painting using just this one brush. It makes broad strokes for the background and bigger washes, and very fine thin lines for the details. You can do so much with just one brush. Let's look at the differences between squirrel brush, red sable brush, and a synthetic one. I start with a red sable brush. The brush feels resilient. If I push the brush flat and then lift it, it springs back in the original shape. Let's do the same with a squirrel brush. When I pull the brush, it has little resilience. It stays almost in the flat shape from pushing. This doesn't feel nice when you add the colors in the background or paint with short strokes building up the shape. Look again at the red sable, how it springs back to the original shape. Now we paint the circles with a synthetic brush. It is very resilient, even more than the red sable. From pushing, it springs easily to the original shape. It means you can directly paint a fine thin line after you've painted a broad flat stroke, and it feels great. So, when can you best use a squirrel brush? It holds a lot of water, because of this it's nice for wetting the paper or to paint big color washes as a background base. I like to choose the colors before I start to paint. Then you can just concentrate on the right colors to use and to mix. If I work with pens, then I adjust them in a plastic box with a bit of a reusable adhesive gum. Just take a bit of it, knead it between your fingers and adjust the pens. Now they're stuck and will not move while you are painting. For moistening the colors, I use a spray. It makes them just wet enough to paint without too much water. To try my colors or to mix them, I always use a ceramic palette or a plate. The surface is smooth and the colors lay perfectly on it without forming separate puddles of paint. Let's test it. With a kneading eraser, light up the pencil lines. It is the best practice to do it before you are going to paint. After watercolor is dry, it can be sometimes difficult to erase the pencil lines, and with rubbing you can take some paint away. Now wet the paper thoroughly. You can use a broad flat brush or a big round squirrel brush. It is important to not wet the tulip because we want it to have sharp edges afterwards. The paper must be very wet. Do it a couple of times. Let the water soak into the paper for a couple of minutes. If the paper is still very wet, you can't paint to enjoy the benefits of wet on wet. The paint will just flow all sides around, the colors will not mix properly with each other and will get muddy. Then use a paper tissue and without any pressure touch the paper very, very lightly to take some moisture away. Paint the edges of the light with yellow. The space above we will let white. This is the best way to create a feeling of light using white paper. Indian yellow is a beautiful color to use for sunny paintings. The sun will not shine without the shadows, so let's mix a dark mix from violet, Indian red and a bit of black. Paint some short lines in yellow. Mix Indian red and Indian yellow and add in the background. Look how beautifully the colors mix with each other on wet paper. Add a little bit of red, it represents the tulips far away. With a fine brush I mix the colors in circles. With the same fine brush paint the background around the tulip. Now we will paint the field with a light orange. Some drops of green in the background. Clean the brush and wet it. Put it on another brush and tap a couple of times. Let the drops fall on wet paper and create more texture. Add violet mixed with blue for the flowers in the field. Tap the brush lightly on your finger to let the paint drops fall randomly on the paper. With a finer brush, add more yellow here and there for a sunny effect. Tap a clean wet brush to let the water drops fall for the texture in the background. With a very fine brush, take some yellow and paint lines in a still wet background. This technique is called drawing with water, but you can use some paint instead of water. I dab my brush with a tissue and I take some color away to make some light accents. The wet paper is very flexible. You can add and remove colors easily. You can also use a piece of paper tissue to remove some color and to create more texture. The edge of the tulip is dry but not smooth. You can remove the color by rubbing the edge gently with a wet brush and dab the place with a paper tissue. Let's mask the top of the painting with a sheet of paper and splash more water drops. Then add some red here and there. With a slightly wet brush, I rub gently in the almost dry background to create light accents. Let your painting dry or use a hairdryer to dry it thoroughly. We begin to paint the tulip with light shades. This is a classic watercolor technique, wet on dry, when you paint on dry paper. You build up a shape in layers from light to dark. Add more red. Clean your brush and dab it with a tissue, then smooth the edges of the previous strokes. It is nice to always have a tissue in your hand when you paint with watercolors. It is handy to dab your brush to take some color away from the paper and so on. After I lay a stroke, I wet my brush a little and diffuse the color to make it lighter. Add more dark purple accents. Dab the brush and with this dry brush stretch the color. Some very light accents in the back petals. When you lay a stroke, clean your brush afterwards and dab it with a tissue. Then smooth the strokes to make them more diffused and natural looking. Some dark fine lines for the texture. Paint the green stalk. The paint must contain very little water. Then clean the brush and diffuse the color down. Mix a darker green and with a fine brush, add it just under the petals. Diffuse dark green in light green with small gentle strokes. Rub the masking places with an eraser. Paint the blue flowers. Use one brush with paint and another clean, slightly wet brush to diffuse the color. With a light yellow-green, paint the leaves. Add dark points for the small seeds. Define the stalk lines here and there. Add some blue spots and after cleaning the brush, diffuse the edges. Some more yellow-green between the flowers. If you see a sharp edge, you can rub on it with a wet brush to smooth it. Mask the bottom of the painting. Take some yellow with a fine brush and put the brush on another brush. Tap a couple of times to splash the yellow drops of paint in the background just above the tulip. It creates a feeling of pollen shining in the air in the sunlight. Thank you for watching. I hope you have enjoyed it. What kind of tutorial would you like to see next? Please let me know in the comments. See you soon!